We're back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at the Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Today, I'm joined by Spencer Brown. Spencer's the spokesman for Young America's Foundation, and he's here to talk to us a bit about what has happened over the past few years on college campuses, because that's crucial. I think that's a lesson that came out of the summer and really that came out of the entire Trump presidency. This was something that people were not paying close enough attention to, although you and the good folks at Young America's Foundation, which in full disclosure, I also work at as director of the National Journalism Center, we're paying attention during a critical moment. And we already know that the Biden administration is poised to bring back some of the failures of the Obama administration, whether that's Title IX reform in its various stages, like the Dear Colleague letters we saw right at the beginning and then at the end of the Obama administration, the Obama second term, in terms of gender identity, sex and gender identity, and also in terms of the kangaroo courts that erupted on campuses over the course of the Obama administration. They're coming back, ladies and gentlemen. So my first question for you, Spencer, is just going to be, what do you think about all of that? What's your reaction to the prospect of a Biden presidency? And where do you think things are going to go in academia?
Well, you're right that there's definitely inflection points where the larger American discussion, whether it be in the news media or wherever, does focus on college campuses and what's going on there, but only at certain points. And it's only when things kind of reach like this critical mass where all of a sudden things kind of bubble over outside of campuses. And so we saw that, just thinking back in the last 5 years or so that I've been very heavily in this space with the foundation. You have the situation at Mizzou with Melissa Click. That was sort of this national conversation about why is there a journalism professor at a university yelling we need muscle over here to kick student journalists out of a very newsworthy situation on their campus.
That was 2015.
Yeah.
And pausing to think about, and not to interrupt you, although I'm happy to interrupt you. I mean, basically what I'm about to say is much more important than what you were going to say.
It's important that you clarify why you're interrupting me, and that's usually accurate. It's not wrong.
I will be making a valid point. It is that 2015, I think it was November, but it was the fall of 2015 at Mizzou when those Black Lives Matter protests erupted on campus. And that's when I was actually working at Young America's Foundation at the time in the job that you're in now. And sort of watching as this played out, the campus, had the feeling of, a war zone. It was a really bizarre place. And for a lot of people, it was their wake-up call. This was a story that was getting published or was getting covered on national media. Yeah. We saw, I remember when there were riots at Berkeley after Trump was elected, again, the national media was covering it. And that was a totally surreal moment. Yeah. But we didn't, it was like 2015, we saw Melissa Click asking for muscle to get student journalists out of a demonstration. And people continue to be shocked in 2020 that we are where we are. But if you were paying attention, this stuff was happening.
Oh, completely. Well, and the crazy thing too is not only were they not paying attention now, just a few short years later, but even around that situation, people were not paying attention to what else was going on. I remember us working together and trying to get these stories out. But before Melissa Click went on this crazy rant, you had sort of this war zone atmosphere with protesters and things on campus, things that are now very normal, unfortunately, in a lot of major American cities and even smaller cities. You also, though, before that, had a hate crime hoax. Long before, not that long before, but long before Jussie Smollett comes along, you have a student on that campus alleging that they're a victim of a hate crime because of their race. And it turns out it was a hoax. They found the footage. He was not actually hit by someone in a car who was targeting him. He basically threw himself on top of a car that was like idling in a parking lot.
This is the trust fund kid, right? Am I thinking of the right one? I think
you're probably right. I wouldn't be surprised. He's at Mizzou, is in some student leadership position. And then before that, we had something that is also what we've been seeing over the last, couple months now is leftist students on that campus were defacing and trying to knock over the Thomas Jefferson statue that's on that campus. So literally everything that we've seen in the last year also happened back in the fall of 2015 on one campus. And it's not just happening on that campus, but we were reporting on them throwing, red paint and ketchup on the Thomas Jefferson statue. We were reporting on the fact that there was this hate crime hoax going on, that the student body was claiming, this campus is unsafe for people based on the color of their skin because people are just driving into them with their cars. all of these things going on. But then what gets the most attention is Melissa Click running around, ironically, because you have like this video that's very dramatic and she just seems, unhinged as she is. But clearly we learned.
By the way, she landed at another journalism
That's
job.
the point I'm about to make, is we learned nothing. And we did nothing to hold the people accountable who enabled this behavior, because now she's just at a different school doing the exact same thing. And
It's a perfect arc.
On that campus, if something happens, I'm pretty sure she's going to be calling for muscle again, or maybe, God forbid, she went to a gym and is her own muscle now and doesn't have to depend on a man. I think she would probably prefer that.
She did not specify how the muscle should identify in terms of gender.
I hate that thought. But yeah, it's true. She didn't do that, which is unwoke for that matter. So it's just like, it's all these things that happened. That was all on one campus in the course of, 2 or 3 months, that should have told us everything we need to know about what happens when this illiberalism just completely gets out of control and unchecked on a campus. And the other thing nobody paid attention to is Mizzou actually suffered for allowing this kind of an atmosphere to exist on their campus. They had to kind of liquidate some of their property. They had to close some dorms down and move people into other buildings. They had to, cut programs back.
Applications dropped, or enrollment dropped.
Because who wants to go to there? That would be insane. So there was actually we saw a little bit of this like market force of people saying, this is not something that I believe is in demand. But we also clearly, as a culture, as a society, whatever, didn't learn enough from that to keep that from happening in the 5 years since.
Yeah, but let's talk about that. That's actually really interesting, because the argument, and obviously there's no way to create right now in the system that our government has set up, and in the climate that our government has set up economically, there's no way to really have a free market response to the corruption in academia. But I want to ask if you think, and this has been my sense, and this is why I'm asking the question, is that...
Is this a trap?
This is not a trap. So I remember when I was in college between 2011 and 2015 at a very liberal school, George Washington University. It's not exactly Oberlin, but it's a very politically charged school, and very politically active, obviously, in DC. And the big fights then were so clearly foreshadowing what was about to happen. But it was really clear that on campuses, speech was equated with violence. This is something that makes no sense to people outside the academic bubble, but is now starting to be the concepts of what constitute, reasonable speech in the workplace. This has been imported into newsrooms and boardrooms from the classrooms, writers' rooms, everywhere.
Yeah.
But my sense is that actually on campuses over the past few years, things have gotten better. And I wonder if you agree with that. And I also wonder I feel like the free speech battle, the momentum is on the side of the right, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I wonder if you think schools have responded perhaps in a market way, because they do get calls from alumni when these stories break. Is that the case? Are schools responding to the backlash?
Kind of, but also only when you actually apply the force directly to them. You talked about the right is winning, and yes, we are. YAF sued UC Berkeley and won in federal court. We sued the University of Florida and won in federal court. We sued a smaller school, Kennesaw State University in Georgia, and won. So there are these victories that you'd think other schools, specifically, within that system or within those areas, people, the trustees of these systems, would be like, hey, let's stop censoring speech based on viewpoint, because otherwise we're going to get embroiled in these legal battles. And obviously, to Janet Napolitano in the UC system, paying the foundation $70,000 in that loss for them it doesn't matter. I mean, she was under fire at the time for having this multi-million-dollar slush fund that nobody was accountable for. So obviously, paying us that money was not a huge, issue for them, and they probably feel like they won even though they lost, because in them everything's backwards.
And everyone gets a trophy.
Everybody gets a trophy. You get a trophy. Berkeley gets a trophy, I guess. But it's just there are definitely key victories for, and I hate that they're considered conservative victories because we're the ones that enforce them and we're the ones that end up winning in them. But it's a win for all students on those campuses, because what this does is not just allow, one speaker like Ben Shapiro to appear on that campus. It forces the university to rewrite their policy and to have free speech policies that say we can't discriminate based on who wants to speak where and when and for how much money or whatever else. And so it makes campuses more close to what they should be, which is this place where a lively, vigorous, free and open exchange of ideas can take place. But so there are those wins, but also we see that things with identity politics and intersectionality and these ideas that speech is violence, Christine Hoff Sommers has told stories for years about how there are classes where you're taught to say ouch if people say something you disagree with, as if you're experiencing physical pain. So like that kind of insanity just is not slowing down. And as recently as I think it was actually earlier this year, which is hard to imagine because this year has been a decade long. But at the beginning of this year at the University of Virginia, we got this video that publicized and was another one of those stories that was carried internationally in the tabloids in London and things like that. So it breaks through once again. But this black student in this multicultural student center that was built at great expense to students or donors or whoever it was, it's resources that university could have been using for research or for actual education. They put in this multicultural student center, and this videos of this woman just yelling, "There are too many white people in here, get out." And is that progress?
That's how I feel right now in this room.
I can leave. I'd rip off my mic if I could. But it's just those situations are not getting any better. And at UVA right now, we're covering another situation where the student government there is trying to implement the strike system that they're going to use against professors and other faculty members for saying things that offend them. The student government has no power over hiring and firing decisions. These strikes are meaningless, but it's more of this sort of feel-good leftist baloney that they're pushing for. And one of our YAF members there at UVA is opposing this and now has received threats of physical violence. People are telling him he shouldn't go out on campus. He shouldn't take a walk because he's not safe. And so schools, it's not like there's some sort of kumbaya moment that's happening on campuses right now.
But don't you think the schools are more hesitant to immediately and reflexively appease the students when they come up with some of these ridiculous demands, like, saying this club can't exist, and it's not that there aren't some schools that are still doing it, but my read on the situation, obviously I'm not as close to it as you are, but my read on the situation has been that there are certain schools whose commitments to at least the concept of free speech have been fortified, and part of that is the U Chicago statement, and part of that is like if you look at the Harper's letter, which probably nobody like people don't really care about because it was a very insular media story, but Harper's letter was signed by a lot of academics and a lot of prominent academics, Noam Chomsky. And so
it's been a weird year.
Right, it's been a weird year. But do you think there's any truth to that? That there's actually some. In my mind, it's partially because this is the reasonable position, and reasonable people understand that, and rather than sort of like trying to save their butts by preventing a PR crisis from the left, they know now that because there's going to be a PR crisis from the left and the right, no matter what they do, alumni are going to be calling them, and there's going to be local coverage of it at the very least, and probably some stuff on conservative blogs, and maybe even like on Fox and Friends. There is a sense that like they actually have to, maybe it's emboldening to the reasonable side of the argument.
I think it does give, again, if there's sort of this room full of administrators on just a generic campus, and you have, again, kind of the crazy couple of faculty members who are just kind of, trying to relive their glory days of the 60s and anti-war protests or whatever.
Which is real.
100% real. That is most faculty today, I think you'd find. Still trying to have the Summer of Love part, I don't know, 2 or 3 at this point. Let me tell you, it did not go well this summer.
The love intensified in the streets of Minneapolis.
We're right. Where's the love? But
Kenosha was just overflowing with love.
It was not. It was not at all.
It was in the aftermath. But go on.
Perhaps. I'm not sure. I haven't been there since, so I'm not sure how loving it feels. But
I drove through Kenosha last week,
and
it felt nice.
Okay. There you go. But you do always have what I've found is generally in these administrations, whenever we're doing sort of a PR offensive to expose what they're doing, we can usually find 1 or 2 people who kind of long for this very nostalgic version of what higher education is, sort of back to like the ivory tower sort of imagery of like, these are people who come and debate lofty things and have lofty ideas, and they argue, and then they all go out to the pub and have a pint after or whatever, as if this is some sort of...
Are they British?
Yeah, now they are. I'm not sure. Maybe that's what I wanted college to be. I don't know. Maybe I'm projecting a little bit much, but there's always one person who's like, again, that reasonable side that now showing how much force conservatives can bring and hold them accountable and sue them in federal court. It gives them arguments to use when they're in those discussions about, do we allow a YAF chapter? Do we ban the speaker? Do we allow the speaker? But also, I mean, just on the whole, that's still how universities act unilaterally. We have university presidents. We have an email. We're suing the University of Minnesota right now in federal court, my home state. But we just actually appealed to the Eighth Circuit, so we're moving beyond and beyond where we've kind of ever been before in our legal work. But we have an email from the president of the university finding out 4 months before the planned lecture was supposed to take place that Ben Shapiro was coming. He has no idea of any threats. He has no idea of any reaction. But he knows who Ben Shapiro is, and he says, we can't have him on the main part of campus, send him across the river to the St. Paul side. And that is that kind of prior restraint based on viewpoint discriminatory restrictions. But here's just a university professor who should know better, but doesn't seem to care, and just tries to save basically his hide and dealing with the unhinged students who would agitate violently at the appearance of Ben Shapiro. And instead, just blanket says, not on my campus.
I think something that is important to remember is that when we talk about the free speech battle on college campuses, that's often now this sort of like front line question, because that is what's at the front of the line. We cannot talk about immense bias in the classroom, which used to be the focus of the right's conversation about academia, and rightfully so. But now we've been tied up in the free speech battle because we literally cannot have conversations about anything because it's all downstream of that. Like I cannot have a conversation about the like nonsense bias against, economic policy against like, I can't talk about bias against trickle down economics, or I can't talk about bias against like in the pro-life conversation on a certain campus because nobody's having the conversation.
Because people like Art Laffer aren't even allowed to speak on a campus. He shows up to speak. Unhinged leftist. This is at SUNY Binghamton up in New York.
Art Laffer.
Keep in mind, these students had no idea who he was.
What was their complaint about him?
They start yelling about Arthur Laffer. So, like, obviously they've never heard of this guy. They just see his name and are going to read it how they think it should be pronounced.
But what is their complaint about him?
Their whole thing was because he received the Medal of Freedom from the president.
From Trump.
Yes. And because he is a proponent of these, small government, lower taxes in order to broaden the tax base. Anybody who's been to a YAF lecture, I know you've heard it before, but he has this very simple message about how we lower the tax rates, we get rid of the loopholes, we have the broadest tax base possible, and you're able to bring in more revenue for the government with a lower tax rate. And that's the message that leftists at SUNY Binghamton, it was this sort of, it was actually a conspiracy that we allege in our lawsuit there, but where the college Democrats on campus were working with this group, appropriately, their acronym is PLOT. It's like basically this like Antifa group in Binghamton, and then another group of another leftist organization. And those three groups together basically planned to shut down the lecture. As soon as Art Laffer literally said, "Hi, I'm Art Laffer," they stood up on desks and tables and started screaming at him with a bullhorn, and security pulled him out. The university did nothing to protect his expression, allowed the protesters to run wild. And so, like you said, everything is downstream. If we can't even have Art Laffer say more than his name,
that's a perfect example.
We cannot argue about the efficacy of lower tax rates when you can't get past what your name is.
Right. And that's not to say, the Laffer curve isn't being taught in some quiet business classrooms.
Sure. Yeah.
But it is to say that there, if we win the free speech battle, there is the battle is far from over, because they're buried beneath the free speech battle is this incredible institution of academia, which is not telling students the full story. And to me now, it's like, seems like that's so quaint, right? Yeah. Because you can't even have Art Laffer say a word on a college
Not allowed. Not allowed.
No, not allowed. Art Laffer, a dangerous man.
No, he's not.
So I actually wanted to get into some of the kind of mechanics of what happens on campuses, because I guess I'm wondering how you would describe, when a student contacts you and says, here's what's going on. What is it that is most important to solving the problem at the school? And I really mean solving the problem, actually creating change. Is it when alumni flood the school's phone with messages and the school's social media or emails? Is it when, this is blanketed all over the media? Do those, does coverage on Fox News matter? Does coverage in, outlets like the Federalist and the Daily Caller? What is most important to actually, is it the conversations that happen on campus with the students? What is it?
Yeah, well, the on-campus conversations with students are kind of another one of those, like, after we win the free speech battle, we can have that right, because we see that, YAF chapters can't even form necessarily, and then they can't host events, things like that come up. But basically, at their core, what we've figured out at the foundation is that all of these universities are technically a business, and they rely on a number of sort of incoming things. So whether that be donations from trustees and alumni, or the physical capital or the sort of personal capital of potential students going to that school. Like we talked about with Mizzou, obviously they suffered significantly because not only did they have fewer students on campus, that meant less money coming in from them, and then less investment otherwise from the government. And so what you have to do is get at and sort of show that there are market forces still at work. And even though these universities are these massive bloated bureaucracies, basically only rivaled by like the EPA as far as just like how complex and ridiculous their guidelines are, you can still get at and chip away at sort of their confidence they have that they're untouchable. And so the biggest thing is just raising awareness about these situations, because obviously when you have like, again, an example like UC Berkeley or the University of Minnesota, these are these behemoth institutions. Berkeley is known as the home of the free speech movement, even though they just lost a free speech lawsuit to us. So like they have a lot of power built up in their reputations, and sort of how probably a lot of people who went there in the past think it still is, whenever it's nothing like when they were there.
Yeah.
And so you have to get the word out in a way that people are going to hear that and not just think like, oh, the kooky conservatives are back, And so it's a lot of the trustees, they have probably the most power as far as the community goes. The students on campus have some power, but again, they're just kind of customers in this weird ecosystem, and they don't have a ton of power to actually change things themselves, which is tragic because they're the ones that are suffering under these systems. And it's absurd that students, in order to have the same rights as their leftist peers, have to file federal lawsuits to get to that point, which is why YAF, comes in, and then media organizations like the Federalist are helpful. But you just have to let people know this is actually what it's like on a college campus. This is not hyperbole. This is every day for millions of conservative students across the country. And so you just have to get the word out there. So whether that's, again, Fox and Friends, if that's Federalist articles, if it's blogs, if it's writing, doing local media stuff, I have, in my work for the foundation, have a press list built up now for just about every major college town in the country, because of how often we end up in these places and messaging on these things where you just have to know, like, here's the one reporter at a network affiliate in, Waco, Texas, who has a soft spot for conservatives and free speech. And you just have to harp on it and harp on it and harp on it until enough people are like, this is troubling, and get them to call the school, get them to write letters, get them to say, I'm withholding support until you show me that you're going to provide a free and open learning environment. And we see that does, not in all cases, but in a lot of cases, that's what you do. You just have to show them that basically their bottom line is on the line. And it's sad that that's sort of their main motivating factor, but it works.
I would assume that local press is actually more powerful than the national press in a lot of these situations. And I shouldn't say I would assume that. I've experienced that when I had that job. But you've been doing it for longer than I did. And it always seemed like that's what actually reaches the immediate community, people who may be donating to the school, people who, it's just sort of like the pipeline to the stakeholders.
Yeah, completely. Well, and in a lot of these college towns, if it's not, like Berkeley and Minnesota are kind of unique because they're in major cities where there's a billion other news things going on.
Right.
But a lot of these college towns that we go to and that we have events in, or where we're having issues, you can, without doing a ton of work, you can be the lead story on the evening news, or you can be on the front page above the fold of the local newspaper, because this is like, this national group is getting involved in holding the school accountable, or is, making sure that students' rights are respected. And so I would say, the one that sticks out to me is the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. There wasn't any other sort of big event going on there at the time. And we were the lead story on every news channel the night that we went with Ben Shapiro amid threats from Black Lives Matter in Salt Lake City and Antifa in Salt Lake City to shut down the event. We were able to thankfully have it because the campus police were on our side and weren't going to let it get shut down. And so the success of the event alone was front page news. The next day I woke up, I was getting on my plane to fly back to DC, and in the airport there's a front page thing that's, Ben Shapiro speaks to packed crowd, and you're like, there you go.
Yeah. And Ben has obviously been indispensable in this like entire battle. And I remember going back to 2015, when the Mizzou stuff was breaking out, it was like the foundation was like, we should get Ben in, and Ben was like, I want to go to Mizzou. And that partnership created this viral sensation that is Shapiro on college campuses, which draws in incredible crowds. Yeah. And when there was a piece not recently, within the last year, about how like campus lectures are the staid conservative, staple, but they don't actually matter. It's like, they do. Yeah. They really do matter, because you actually create a conversation now online. Mm-hmm. There's live streaming, there's media coverage, and people start to think about these things. Yeah. And also there are tons of students that go. Oh yeah. And this is for a lot of these campuses, this is the event of the year when Ben Shapiro comes, and there's mass protests. There's people who are curious that are just going to hear him speak. There's people who love him and are his biggest fans that are there to, hear from him. And so these are like major events on campuses.
Yeah, no, it's a huge deal. And what's amazing to me is to see the reaction of the campus community, even among those who didn't think they were interested, who didn't think they would go, who had kind of an impression in their mind of what Ben Shapiro coming to their campus would look like based on what, their peers say or what people say online. And then to see how shocked they are when it's nothing like what they expected. And I think probably one of sort of the coolest responses that we've seen is when we brought Ben to the University of Southern California. It was a fight to get that even set up. The school was, nervous about having him there because of the leftist opposition and how they often turn violent and things like that. But thankfully they did the right thing and allowed the event to happen. They provided a ton of campus security. They, of course, had sort of this very large area just adjacent that was their First Amendment area for all the protesters to stand out there, and they were shouting all their usual just absurd things. But after the event, we were going through and just searching on hashtags and things to see what people had said about the event, to see if there was anything, worth flagging for the rest of our team. And we found this one student who, after looking at their page, they're clearly a liberal, and they posted a picture of this line that stretched the full length of the main road that goes through campus of people waiting to get into this event. And the student just reflected on how they expected it to be all these white men waiting to go see Ben Shapiro, and how they were so shocked to see this incredibly diverse audience waiting to hear Ben Shapiro and his ideas. And after seeing that, he thought, well, if they're in line, I might as well hear what he has to say, and came to the event. Yeah. This is somebody who hated Ben Shapiro, thought he had nothing good to say, thought this was just some, ridiculous far-right thing. And then realized, just again, like positive peer pressure, saw all of his peers that looked like him and looked like what he didn't think the people who attended would look like, and decided to come with. And we have that. I mean, that's happened at events across the country. We had students who showed up to protest a Ben Shapiro lecture, who then sat through it, listened to what he had to say, and thought that's a way more aspirational message than what the leftists are telling me, and then joined the YAF chapter at that school and became an all-star activist. It's insane.
And part of the reason this stuff works is because the students aren't hearing this side in the classroom. And like now they have access to YouTube and podcasts and every like different outlet on the internet. But still, like this is the other side that they're not being taught in the classroom. So they are genuinely like very, very hungry to learn why there are only two sexes, because that is not what their schools are teaching. And they want to hear somebody the right considers an authority on it, explain explain traditional marriage, explain why there aren't, why gender fluidity is a myth, explain why feminism has corrupted a generation. Like this is not what they're getting. Well, I'm working and I'm a woman, so questionably doing a terrible job. I will get back to the kitchen. This summer, obviously, we've talked about this a ton at the Federalist, but this moment of intense iconoclasm that sprung forward this summer after the death of George Floyd, it did seem like I'm not even going to use the word seem. What we saw was the fruits of the steady radicalization of academia that evolved to a point 1,000%. Of critical mass, where now it had sort of like, because there was a monolithic ideology that did not get competition, it morphed into this like calcified, stupid ideology that believes speech should be restricted to the sort of far left progressivism that is now in the workplace. Why were people not paying attention? And I have to say, it still seems to me like people aren't paying attention, because you mentioned like, getting these stories covered and local news, getting these stories covered in national news. That does happen. But I just wonder why it hasn't like sunk in. No. It seemed to sink in over the summer. but I'm already sensing that that's sort of fading. Why do people not pay attention to this? Why do we as a culture have such a hard time internalizing the gravity of this issue?
Well, I think part of it is people who are sort of, I don't know necessarily which generation I would put this with, but people who are established in the different facets of our culture and industry and things like that, I think often look at situations like Mizzou and summers like the one we just had and sort of look at it as a novel thing and don't take the view of this has actually been a rising wave, that every time we get one of these things, it gets a little bit more intense and there's a little bit more damage. But because there's kind of enough of an ebb in between, people don't take this as being a larger actual sort of culturally changing movement. I think they see this as little kind of blips almost on a radar rather than seeing this as a whole flock of stuff coming in all at once. And so you see them not taking it seriously until it's too late for them to do anything to stop it. And so I think that's partially what we see with, again, universities and stuff, because it is always just like, there's one or two stories a year generally that sort of break that national threshold. And people are like, oh, the kids are not all right. And there's all this, sort of an reflective commentary on, where this came from and the history of campus protests. And it's never actually addressing like, okay, now that this is just sort of a mainstream cultural viewpoint that speech is violence, and that now means that people in HR departments believe this and
enforce it,
which is the scariest part. And I think it doesn't just go for those, like that is one of the sort of the core, like the scariest ideas, that things you disagree with are justification for me to use physical self-defense against you to stop you from saying things I disagree with, because that's how we get this violence that spills over and becomes so ridiculous. But also the equally bad but seemingly less nefarious things. Like today I saw, I believe it was NASDAQ, asked like the SEC or something for permission to require any companies traded on its index to have a diversity quota and a woman on the board.
Yeah.
And it's these other things that, again, are just sort of these, the left.
Women should not be working.
What are you doing here? But just this idea that these leftist sort of ideas and beliefs and the orthodoxy, which is also constantly changing, so no one is safe. We've seen that before. I mean, anyone can be canceled at any time, whether they're woke today or woke yesterday. They're still not safe. But this constantly changing stuff is, again, it looks like a wave, but it's really just piling up on us. And so again, like now, if it becomes where, your company can't be traded on NASDAQ, if maybe you can't find a woman who wants to work on your board, like maybe it is, I can't think of what the example would be. Maybe you can help me out. But like, what if they're like, you're mandating, again, hiring people just based on what is confusingly also not a concrete thing. If gender and sex means nothing, then how can we mandate that you put a woman on your board? Like it doesn't make any sense. That's where we are, and that's what the NASDAQ is now proposing.
Yeah, and that's an incoherence that goes to something much deeper on the left. But there
are many, many.
It is an important one. So, based on that, have you, like, we're staring down the barrel of 4 years of a Joe Biden administration that reverting to this terrible era of Title IX. Something that's funny to me is when I was in college, everyone was just talking about Occupy Wall Street, the first half of my college experience.
The good old days.
Yeah, and it was like sort of the Tea Party era. And, as a conservative student, it was a lot of like, this is why limited government is the solution to a lot of our problems. Like, this is why limited government is the moral system of government. And I just don't think that's a conversation that happens at all in terms of economics on campuses anymore.
I don't think so.
So I'm wondering if you've seen any changes in conservative students over like the last half decade, or maybe over just the Trump administration. And how do you expect what direction would you expect that to go under Joe Biden?
Yeah, I think honestly, the one thing that has been kind of heartening is to see students who, because of the Occupy Wall Street, a lot of the conservative messaging was based on economic things. And I think
based on it.
Maybe at, the movement's peril or our appeal, there was also kind of just this general movement that we shouldn't address the social issues
Yes, there was.
Those are losing issues. And we had, I believe it was the CRNC actually did their autopsy report after the 2012 election that basically said, we can't talk about that anymore. Basically how...
There's a very prominent youth group right now that made a clear effort for a while to steer totally clear of cultural issues and to only focus on economic issues. And that was, I think that must have been around like 2014. And it was because there was that libertarian moment, if people remember. And there was this notion that, social conservatism is enormously off-putting and will not bring people into the fold. So do not talk about abortion. Do not talk about marriage. Do not talk about sex and gender. And now it's literally all students talk about.
Right.
And the conflicts over those questions are the ones that have brought so many new people, not just students, but new people, driven them away from the left. And it's just mind-boggling to me that there were people, it's mind-boggling to me in and of itself that the conservative movement was really focused on hammering home those economic ideas in that time. It makes a lot of sense because of Obama.
Yeah.
But because Obama, hashtag. But at the same time, it's mind-boggling to me because those issues are now so central.
Well, completely. And so what I was saying is over the last 4 or 5 years, seeing students being willing to talk about those issues with their peers, being willing to have those hard conversations that they were their kind of coming of age into political discourse was that we don't talk about those things because those are losing issues for us. They've realized, and I think maybe have kind of overthrown what the reigning sort of general consensus was that we don't talk about those things, and said, no, actually, like on my campus, you want to know how I find people? My YAF chapter becomes the home of the people who believe that there are men and there are women.
Yeah.
And it's,
or that you can say things.
And it's such a basic, yes, of course that makes sense. But that message on a lot of college campuses is absolutely counterculture and revolutionary. And that's what ends up bringing people over. And I think, I'm not sure if she wrote on it, but I know I saw a Twitter thread from Inez the other day.
Inez Stepman of Independent Women's Forum, Federalist contributor.
Yes, talking about how this idea that, economic issues are the only things we can talk about. And no, if we want to ever get to the point, sort of with the same thing, if we don't have free speech on campuses, we can never discuss the economic issues. If nobody wants to hear from us, they're not going to hear us talking about why there are men and there are women. We need to, I believe the phrase she used was, we need to be the home of the anti-woke. And just be like, let them have their absolute inanity. You can come over here and feel like a normal person again, who's treated like an individual with certain rights and certain ideas. And then we can get on, like once we have that coalition, like a coalition of the willing and the anti-woke, then we can go on and talk about tax reform again.
So obviously acknowledging the immoral cost or the moral costs of policies that I expect to come from a Biden administration. Yeah. I'm thinking particularly in terms of Title IX, and those are foremost on my mind because they impact literally so many children's health. And it's something that people don't think about or talk about enough in terms of national elections. I don't know why. People are starting to, particularly on the right, like American Principles Project and Terry Schilling over there putting together ads on this sort of thing in Georgia. And in swing states, Michigan, I guess Georgia's a swing state too. But I guess I'm wondering where you think all of this goes under Biden, acknowledging the costs of his policies. Is it also possible that a Biden administration sets up a climate in which the left continues to drive people towards the right and continues to increase the ranks of conservative students on campus?
I think as far as Title IX goes and the way it was already being used kind of as a bludgeon against people of differing ideologies rather than being used to somehow protect victims of, abuse and assault and harassment and things like that, it was already being used, to
limit speech.
We have YAF students have Title IX complaints filed against them routinely for hosting somebody like Ben Shapiro on their campus. Like students file a Title IX complaint over that. Like they don't even know the person. They've never talked to them. They've never met them. But because of the way the system was set up, they could file that complaint. And that student who hosted a speaker had to then go through the kangaroo court and prove their innocence against no evidence, no ability to question or challenge or face an accuser. And it was just insane. And so what, through the last, it took almost 4 years to do it, but what the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, and her team and Candace Jackson over there in that office did, which was so amazing, was have this final rule, get rid of these stupid Dear Colleague letters that the Obama administration had used and put into place this final rule on Title IX that carries the force of law that actually did away with these kangaroo courts, expanded protections for survivors, brought these constitutional principles, brought due process back. And so
what a concept.
Literally revolutionary today. Yeah. It's insane. But thankfully, the way that was put in place, it is going to be more difficult to undo that than it was for Secretary DeVos to undo the Dear Colleague letter that didn't have any real, force of law. So that is that is one thing that I'm worried if they try to bring it back to the system as it was when Obama was president. That's just going to be used as a bludgeon, like you said again. I think the other thing, as far as campus issues that is in the news right now, is student loans and student loan forgiveness, free college, things like that has become a topic of pretty big discussion again, which if you remember during sort of the primaries, that was one of the litmus tests that everybody was talking about. Are you going to provide free college to everyone? Are you going to forgive student loans? And obviously that's a horrible idea, and it's not going to fix anything, because anybody who thinks momentarily I got free money is going to be paying that back over the course of their life in higher taxes, or at least for the next decade probably. And it's incredibly unfair. These people never shut up about social justice, and then they're going to go make the entire country pay for the college educations that only less than 1/3 of Americans get. So that means there's 2/3 of the American people who never got a 4-year degree who are now working hard to pay for not their own college, but somebody else's.
Yeah.
Not to mention the people like me who took out student loans, but paid them back ahead of time and played by the rules.
You made a great decision to become a welder, and now you have to pay for Jennifer's women's studies degree.
Congrats, Jennifer. Like, what? It is the most unfair, socially unjust thing that we could do. And I'm worried that it's going to be more stuff like that. More stuff like, remember Pajama Boy when Obamacare was rolled out? I mean,
I could never forget. Burned into my mind.
Oh, gosh.
Indelible.
Like, it's going to be just sort of the same stuff. And I was looking back at some of my writing from when I did the National Journalism Center internship and was writing political commentary in the summer of 2014. So you're sort of, in the lame duck of the Obama administration, and he was just doing a lot of stuff. That was when he made comments about, I have a pen and a phone and I can do what I want, and was doing all these executive orders.
I too have a pen and a phone.
Do you?
Yeah, I can do what I want.
Okay. You're not supposed to work though, because remember.
Women.
Yeah. But looking back at how the Obama administration treated and talked about and messaged to young people was so incredibly condescending, and was, again, just part of this ploy to convince people that they need government in order to succeed, basically. And so I think we're going to get a lot more of that, but sort of on steroids, because now you have forces like the Squad, and you have a lot of other, I think, sort of more radical forces with a larger seat at the table that didn't necessarily have that. I remember conservatives were very, very nervous about how radical President Obama was, and obviously his policies were not good. But I think that was sort of just a taste, sort of one of those waves that now is about to come crashing in, because now not only do they have the support if in the White House, they also now have all of these people across the country in leadership positions in important places who can inflict the same kind of damage.
You thought you were worried about Rahm Emanuel. Wait until you meet Ilhan Omar for Young America's Foundation. You can follow him on Twitter at It's Spencer Brown. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at the Federalist. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious.